Trump 2028. President Trump has hinted at potentially running for a third term for president. But what if I told you that all the shade and heat being thrown on this issue, President Trump isn't the first one who has recommended this. Multiple members of Congress, multiple past presidents have hinted at the idea of repealing the 22nd Amendment. So what is the 22nd Amendment? Should there be term limits on presidents? Why are there term limits on presidents in the United States? Those are all questions worthy of debate, and there's no one better to do that than Dr. Adam Carrington of Ashland University, who joins us to break down those questions and more. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chan, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm Sam Chan. President Trump has hinted at potentially running for a third term. And while people aren't sure if he's saying this tongue in cheek, the Trump website has been selling Trump 2028 hats, and his advisor Steve Bannon has said in no uncertain terms that he is looking forward to a third Trump presidency. But this isn't the first time in American history a president has suggested running for more than one term. Certainly FDR did and was elected to 4 terms. So what is the story behind presidential term limits? Should we have them? Is there a way around the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution? Dr. Adam Carrington is the Associate Professor in History and Political Science at Ashland University and the co-director of the Ashbrook Center. He's a constitutional scholar and he joins us today. Dr. Carrington, welcome back to Face the Issues.
Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Adam, let's get right into the 22nd Amendment. I'm going to start by reading it. No person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice, and no person who has held the office of president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of president more than once. And then it goes on and says this article doesn't apply to people who are currently in office and so forth and so forth. But essentially, the interpretation of this has been you get 2 terms and 10 years, if you were, say, the vice president and the president passed away, you became president in the last year or 2 of that presidency. So 2 terms, 10 years. Is that how you understand this in layman's terms?
Yes, I do. I mean, there's been some attempt to focus on the elected language, that you can only be elected twice, but you could perhaps be the Speaker of the House or the Vice President, and then the presidency could open up as a vacancy and you could go in. I don't read that as even being a loophole, though, because the 12th Amendment says that for the vice presidency, the person can't be vice president who would be ineligible to then be president. And I would read the 22nd Amendment as doing that, but essentially it has been followed or understood generally as you can be elected twice, and that's it, with the exceptions that you had read.
Let's jump into what you said about the 12th Amendment. I said in the intro, President Trump has hinted at a third term. They're selling Trump 2028 hats. With this president, I tell people when I do commentary for the networks, focus on what he does and maybe not as much on what he says. Because selling Trump 2028 hats, in my mind, is a great business model, regardless of whether you intend to run or not. And so I don't know that he is serious or not serious about this. Certainly, I think there are supporters of his that are serious about this. But one of the arguments that they're raising is the idea that Vice President Vance could run for president with Trump as the vice president. And you're saying the 12th Amendment wouldn't allow that.
That's the way I would read it. Now, that's not the universal view. In fact, the first president that this was ever obligatory on, the 22nd Amendment, Dwight Eisenhower, he once got a laugh by kind of joking at a press conference that could be the way that was being talked about could be the way that he could get in. But I think that the essence of the 22nd Amendment was to limit how many times and how long a president could be in office. So I think looking at what the purposes were, to have someone be able to be endlessly re-eligible so long as he's vice president and then the person ahead of him resigns would be to play to take the text and not read it in any way, shape, or form in relation to the purpose. And that's just not good constitutional interpretation. The purpose of the text is partly how we figure out what the text itself means. And it would be a reading of the text in a literal way that would undermine the very purpose for which it was created and ratified.
What about, I mean, you mentioned this earlier, what about down that order of succession, Speaker of the House, President pro temp of the Senate, or a cabinet member? I mean, could a former president serve in a cabinet? We certainly have cabinet members who would not be eligible to be president. Would they just skip over that? What's your take? And I don't think we've had that situation yet, but what would your take be on that hypothetical?
Yeah, and by the way, we did have John Quincy Adams go back into Congress when he was after, but he was not serving in a position that would have put him in line for the presidency. That's a good question. I think that ultimately you would probably have to say you would have to probably change the way that the law is structured. And most of presidential succession below, vice president and such, most of that, although not all of that, is established by statute. So I think you would want a statutory change to make sure that the person isn't constitutionally in line for the presidency, and that if he is statutorily, that there's a bypass in the legislation itself would be, I think, the best and wisest way to go about this.
The other argument was the one that was voiced by Steve Bannon, who had been part of that Trump team, especially in that first term. His suggestion was run regardless, that the Supreme Court has authority but not power to enforce its decisions. The president has to enforce the decisions. If you run regardless, how would the court possibly enforce the 22nd Amendment? Is there a way for the court to enforce the 22nd Amendment?
Well, that goes to the question, is there a way for the court to enforce anything? And if you go back to Federalist 78, one reason Publius said that the courts were the weakest branch was they didn't have money to try to get people to do what they wanted. That's what Congress had. And they didn't have the sword, the threat of coercion or violence to get people to obey them. That's what the executive had. So technically, no, they don't have their own police or military force. It's supposed to be done by the executive branch itself. That's a moment where the Constitution would be tested, but ultimately who would be tested would be the American people, regardless of what they think of a particular man occupying the office. Do they have a higher support for and allegiance to the supreme law of the land, the Constitution, and therefore to the idea that we are ruled by laws and not by men? And would they make that determination in who they voted for or in subsequent litigation if the Supreme Court decided a certain way that didn't allow someone to take office? So I think that would be, Bannon is asking for a true, I would say, constitutional crisis. I think that phrase gets overused, but I think that would be truly one that would demand of the American people the ability to think beyond a particular election and to show their commitments to the rule of law over a particular candidate preference.
I've worked in government and in politics a long, long, long time, and I'm not sure I have a lot of confidence in the ability of a people to not say, well, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Let me ask you this, Adam. Is there a scenario where Trump wins a third term, the Chief Justice Roberts or any member of the court refuses to swear him in? I mean, is that swearing in just a matter of, is that just symbolic? Is he still the president if no one on the court will swear him in?
Here would be you're really asking the same question again in a different manifestation. So it's a good other way of testing the same question, which is, do we really think that the president's power comes indirectly from the people, but directly through the Constitution, and therefore the president isn't really the president unless all the constitutional mechanisms have been followed. I would argue that he would not be president if you could not make that happen, if you could not follow all of the procedures, not just the Electoral College, but the swearing in, the use of the oath, the use of the oath administered by the proper person, constitutionally speaking. All of that, I think, would be required. So again, the kind of question is, to what degree do we think the Constitution is the supreme law of the land? And to what degree do we believe it's just advice that we, the people, can take or leave in some way, shape, or form? Some of these may seem small compared to other elements, but the Constitution, every word of the Constitution is equally the supreme law of the land by its own definition. And if we're really going to respect it as such, we need to treat it as such, even in the minutia.
Let's step away from Trump for a moment. Is this similar if, say, someone who was, I mean, you and I, unfortunately, are both now old enough to run for president. This is my first election where people said they were going to write me in. I couldn't honestly say that I'm not old enough, which is unfortunate. But let's say someone who is not old enough, who's 30 years old, decides to run and somehow gets the electoral vote and wins. I mean, they're not permitted constitutionally to be president. But would this be a similar situation if they were, a test of the Constitution where they won the Electoral College, maybe they're even sworn in, but they actually are not permitted to serve?
Exactly, because those aren't all the criteria. The Electoral College is required to win a majority, or if not, to go through the process in the House that thankfully we haven't had in a long time. But also there are criteria. It would be the same thing as if the president was not a natural born citizen and other things along those lines. Or if a president had been impeached, removed from office, and declared ineligible to serve again, if that person was elected again. It's all coming from the same source. The very source that says winning the Electoral College is part of why you were legitimately the president is the same document that has those other requirements, such as natural born citizen, age requirements, swearing in requirements, all of those other things. So again, I think it's an all or none proposition if you really believe the Constitution rules.
The same document that prevented Hillary Clinton from being president despite winning the popular vote is the document that would prevent President Trump from running for a third term.
Exactly, because again, that's not part of the rules. It's nice to win the popular vote, but it's ultimately the same as collecting the most hits in a baseball game. That's not what decides who wins. It's who gets the most runs. Right. And that's why the complaining about Hillary Clinton in 2016 may seem unfair in some grand scheme, but it is absolutely not what the process was. President Trump won by the process that has always been in place, and so therefore he was legitimately president. We would want to apply the same standard here to all the criteria the Constitution mandates. And
we're going to go to the break. When we come back, we're going to talk about why the 22nd Amendment exists, and we're going to get your thoughts on whether it should exist. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
Watch Lighthouse TV wherever you go. Available on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. You can view our in-house studio productions on demand, or watch what's on the station right now with our 24/7 live stream. Search Lighthouse TV online on your streaming device, or go to our website for more information. Visit lighthousetv.org to stay connected. There you can find out what's currently on the air and coming up, how to watch in your area on cable, satellite, broadcast, or streaming devices. Watch past programs or our live stream. Follow us on social media and learn more about the station, our hosts, and our programming. Lighthouse TV, positively different.
Welcome back to Face the Issues. Alan, let's pick up where we left off. We talked about a few of the different ways proposed. Is there, from where you sit, is there any way to secure a third term for president without repealing the 22nd Amendment?
Other than that exception that you took over someone else's term less than 2 years in, no, I don't think so. I think it would take the repeal of the 22nd Amendment. And again, I think that not only makes sense of the text, it makes sense of the history. Because what it seems to really follow is even before the 22nd Amendment, there was a tradition that FDR broke, but had been followed for a very long time, that the president only serves 2 terms. That was modeled by George Washington. It was affirmed by Thomas Jefferson and was followed, not always willingly, but followed ever since. And so I think, again, that makes sense not only of the text of the amendment, but also the history that it seemed to be calling upon in setting that 2-term limit.
Why did it pass the 22nd Amendment then? I mean, yes, FDR won 4 terms. We were also in the time of war. Was this just a reaction to FDR? What was the driving force behind the 22nd Amendment?
Mostly, yes, I think it was a reaction. Not that FDR wasn't popular and wasn't respected and obviously elected the times he was, but the process was started in 1947. That timing matters. So shortly after FDR was passed away in office, it was started by I believe, a Republican Congress, so maybe that had a little bit to do with it. But it gained the approval it did in the states over the next 4 years. It was ratified in February of 1951 because I think the idea was, we don't want this to just be a tradition anymore. We want it to be a hard, firm requirement because we believe history now has shown it to be a wise limitation. And we want to, and really it was in some ways a rebuke of FDR, as much as he continues to be beloved, to say, we believe this is long enough for someone to serve in the office of chief executive.
This is not the first time it's been proposed of repeal. I think a lot of times people are pushing for the repeal because they love, in this case, they love President Trump. This is currently is Congressman Andy Ogles of Tennessee. But I think people support the 22nd Amendment because they hate the idea of a 3rd Trump term. But there have been nearly 60 resolutions to repeal the 22nd Amendment since it was ratified. And just from 1997 to 2013, Congressman Jose Serrano from New York, a Democrat, proposed 9 times to repeal it. This was during Clinton, during Bush, during Obama. So he did it during a Republican presidency. What, outside of the politics of we need a Barack Obama, we need a Donald Trump, what is the argument here for repealing the 22nd Amendment?
And I will say, no less a person than Alexander Hamilton, I am very confident, would have opposed the 22nd Amendment. If you go back to Federalist 71 and 72, after he's talked about energy being the quality for a good executive and executive power, he goes on to say that republics aren't great at stability and experience. They're good at being based on the will of the people. They're good at change when change is needed, but they're not always stable in the administration of their laws. And he imagined that a good president might get elected over and over again for life, and that if he was a good administrator, that would give him the experience to be better and better at his job, and it would also give stability in the administration of the laws that he thought sometimes republics or popular governments lacked. So the other is a popular vote argument. Presidents do have term limits without the 22nd Amendment. It's 4 years. And then it's up to the people to decide in their wisdom whether they want to continue the president in or not. And they have that option regardless of the 22nd Amendment. So those would be the arguments. And I would say, I know Bill Clinton wishes he could have run again for a 3rd term. He said as much. Ronald Reagan wrote something and vocally said he wished the 22nd Amendment could be repealed, that he could run again. President Obama made some comments at least hinting at that. So it's been a bipartisan question. Is this a proper reaction to limiting the power of the presidency, or is it too much a limit on the office, and is it too much a limit on the American people? So as much as people, it got the support to be an amendment, I think there are legitimate questions as to was it the wisest thing. There are arguments for the other side.
Adam, the interesting thing is, at the same time, there is a appetite for congressional term limits. Is this hypocrisy of we'll put term limits on Congress but not on the president, or is this reflective of their different roles? I mean, the same argument against, having worked in Congress, the argument against is if you limit members of Congress, you lack stability, in part because you've also limited the president. And then what really happens is bureaucracy becomes the only stabilizing force, and unelected bureaucrats get more and more power. That's not exactly what Madison wanted in Federalist 39. But is there argument here that we should term limit Congress instead of the executive, or what's your take on that?
Well, there's opinions all over the map, but I would say it is. And I can see a way that you could make a distinction. A congressman or woman is only one member out of 435 or out of 100. So there can be continuity even without that. The president is just one person. So there's a concentration of the power that he exercises. But I think ultimately, what you just said, the argument that at least a Hamilton and some of the other founders would have made for the presidency, they would say the same thing for Congress, that you want stability. If people are good at their elected office and the people like what they're doing, they should be returned as long as they're still good at their office and as long as still the people want to return them. So I would think that even though one might be able to make some distinction between the nature of the offices, really it is ultimately an inconsistency to have that limit for one and not the other.
What's your take on this? Should the 22nd Amendment stay? Should it be repealed? I know your take is without it being repealed, you don't get a third term. Like, there's no circumventing this. But what's your take on the amendment itself?
Well, and regardless of who I think should be in the office, I would say two things. One, I think ultimately I would be in favor of repealing it and just leaving it to voters. But I also don't know that it's a massively important point because, unlike in Congress, the long-standing tradition that presidents only serve 2 terms anyway, and that I think because the president is one person and is the center of attention, that natural fatigue with particular occupants of the office would be an even more natural limitation on how long they were president than it would be for Congress. So while I would lean toward repeal, I also think the historical and natural limitations that already exist wouldn't change the reality on the ground that much.
Yeah, and I think that we've seen that with governors of states that don't have term limits, where after 3 highly popular, Scott Walker of Wisconsin beat a recall election, and then later eventually lost an election just having been there for as long as he was. So I think that's a super astute observation. Adam, thank you for breaking that down for us and for your insights on this topic.
Great to be here, and thank you for having this forum that we can have these conversations. I think it's really important as citizens to do so.
I appreciate that. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Face the Issues is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different. Watch Lighthouse TV wherever you go. Available on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. You can view our in-house studio productions on demand, or watch what's on the station right now with our 24/7 live stream. Search Lighthouse TV online on your streaming device, or go to our website, lighthousetv.org, for more information. Lighthouse TV. Positively different.
Welcome back to Face the Issues. Adam, you're at Ashland University in the Ashbrook Center. One of the things that's coming up across the country is America 250. We're reaching our 250th birthday. And big deal here where our studios are outside of Philadelphia, but big deal all over the country. And I understand you guys are doing some stuff for it at the Ashbrook Center.
Yeah, so the Ashbrook Center is really dedicated to civic education, both with the students that are here on campus, but also nationally for anyone that wants to learn. So we're going to be having a series of podcasts. We're going to be having some events that one can go look for, both locally and in other places across the country. And we're going to be having educational opportunities that we're going to go across the country to try to bring seminars and other things and really take advantage of this moment, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, to renew the things we need to know to be good citizens. Thomas Jefferson called the Declaration an expression of the American mind. So how we're really trying to be part of the broader effort of renewing that American mind in the image of the principles on which this country was founded.
Right. As we headed at 250 mark, for you as a faculty member, as a professor of political science and history, are you concerned at all about the level of civic literacy in this country?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's very clear that we're at a low point, maybe not the lowest ever, but we're certainly at a low point, and that your government or your political community is only as good and virtuous as the people who are in charge. And ultimately, it's we, the people, that are in charge. I am encouraged by certain trends. I think people are really starting to invest in K through 12 education, in citizen education, even for people outside normal traditional schooling. We're trying to be part of that as well. Programs like these discussions, I think, are part of that. But there's a lot of work to do. It's an uphill climb, but I think the number of people trying to climb it, I'm encouraged by, and I think we just need to use this opportunity next year, regardless of your political affiliation, regardless of any other sort of factors where you're from, that to take this opportunity to try to better our communities through increased knowledge of our principles, our history, and to do so in the context of the 250th anniversary of this experiment in self-government.
Well, Adam, I appreciate the role that you play in all of this, and not just teaching, but the shows coming on this show. I know you do a lot of other podcasts and shows, really able to kind of take these issues and explain the civics and the ideas of governance behind them to the public. And so I really appreciate the work that you're doing toward this.
Well, thank you. It is an honor and a privilege, and I think really a trust to be a teacher in the United States of America and to work with the next generation and just doing what I can to be worthy of that. I know you're doing that work as well. So just want to do the best possible and leave an intellectual legacy that maybe makes the country just a little bit better.
Yeah, couldn't have said it better. Adam Carrington of Ashland University, thank you again for joining us, Adam, and we look forward to celebrating 250 together.
Thank you. You as well. Yep.
Thanks. My thanks to Adam Carrington for joining us, and of course my thanks to each of you for tuning in as well. We hope to see you again right back here next week. Until then, my name is Sam Chan. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.